So good. Well, this morning, I wanted to start by sharing that Sharon and I have some very exciting news. No, she is not pregnant. I think Sharon would die. Beginning on June 8th, Sharon and I are going to be able to have our first joint sabbatical since launching Bright City Church. And we are so excited. We have alternated over the years taking those, but this will be our first time to just, both of us to be off, to experience being just husband and wife, not leading a church together. And so we're really excited about that, but I want to invite you to be praying for that time for us as well. And just that it's restful and life-giving for our family. As we said, we're excited to have the elementary kids in the room this morning for Big Church Sunday. And in light of that, I actually was thinking about my time in elementary school this week as I was preparing for this sermon. And I remembered that in second or third grade, I had a teacher who, she was a very good teacher. Let me be clear. She was a very good teacher, but I'd also been taught, and I don't know if this is still kind of the way things are done, but I'd been taught to treat my teacher with the utmost respect. To show them tremendous respect. And so there was almost this sense of if I was going to my teachers for something, I needed to have a good, clear reason why I was going into their presence, why I was approaching them, why I was talking to them, and I needed to be prepared. I didn't need to fumble my words. I needed to be prepared to talk to this teacher. And so to go into their presence felt like a very serious thing, not something to take lightly. And it wasn't because they were mean or angry or impatient. It's just because of who they were, what they signified as a teacher. One of the things that we did as a part of that, though, and maybe you did this when you were in school, maybe you still do this as someone in school, but we would go to our friend when we needed something. We would go to a friend and say, you know what, hey, she really likes you. Can you ask her if we can play Heads Up, 7-Up? I was hoping many of you would know that game. We're going to play right now. But we thought, okay, this person is going to be our mediator. They would go to the teacher on our behalf because they had favor with the teacher. They were the ones that had prepared for the test. They had done well in the class. They had done their homework. They came prepared every day. And so they were more qualified to enter the teacher's presence and receive a favorable response. I begin there this morning because at the time of Jesus and the early church and really before that, God was thought of in a similar way, that there was a fear about entering God's presence. And so because of that, there were specific individuals who were chosen to go to God on people's behalf because they would have a better chance of receiving a favorable response. These people were chosen and they would spend their life preparing for these moments where they would go into God's presence on behalf of the people in order to receive a more favorable response. These were called priests, and I'm sure you've heard that before, you're familiar with that, but a very simple definition I want to give you for a priest. A priest mediates the relationship between humans and God. A priest goes to God on humans' behalf. It represents us before God. So I want to begin there this morning because we're in a series on the letter of Hebrews. And this letter was written to a community of believers, of folks who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but were wrestling with a pull back to the Jewish communities that they had come out of. And so this author is writing and addressing some of the things that may be pulling them back to the communities that they came out of in order to remind them that whatever it is that they're experiencing that's pulling them back to the community they came out of, Jesus is better. And one of the things that the early Christian church did not have was priests. And so there were a couple of reasons that I think priests were an appealing idea, something that would have made them consider going back to the communities they came out of. And I think that they are reasons that are still true for us today as we think about religious leaders in our world. The first reason that this might have been appealing is if they had the feeling that no matter how much they did, they would never be good enough to go into God's presence. And so it was a relief to know that they had a priest to do that for them. Someone that had been preparing, who could enter God's presence on their behalf. But another reason might have been the feeling that they didn't really care about this stuff. And so it's kind of convenient that we have someone to do that for us because it checks that box just in case. And so it's convenient to have somebody to do that because they don't really want to spend time or not interested in doing that anyway. The reason that what we're talking about this morning matters is because of two very important but very different thoughts that I think we maybe coming to church have. Or maybe when we first came to church, we had this thought, or maybe we still wrestle with these thoughts. But I want to share these because these are two thoughts that I think this week's message speaks to. The first one is this, that I don't do God, I don't do church, I don't do Jesus because the only God that I'd worship is the one that accepts me just as I am. Another thought, the other one is that I don't do God or Jesus or church because I have this shame, this guilt, this sense of being unforgivable, and the idea of going near that, I feel like I don't belong there, that it's not a place for me, that I'm unforgivable and it wouldn't do any good anyways. And I'm wondering if you find yourself on one of those sides or the other, or maybe you tend towards one or the other. We're talking about priests because Hebrews, and this author wants us to understand that the idea of a priest helps us understand some important things about Jesus and these two thoughts. The image of a priest is going to help us understand some things that he wants to say about Jesus, but also how it's going to address these two thoughts. To give you some historical context, to flesh this out a little bit, as I said earlier, God was and is holy, understood to be holy, but understood to be entirely set apart and perfect. And because God was so completely holy and other than us, we could not enter just as we are. We could not enter God's presence just as we are. But I think this is something that we often get wrong. This wasn't because God is angry or wrathful or vengeful. I think of it more like that holiness is like the heat of the sun, that everything that comes near it is affected by it. And anything that is not like it melts away in its presence. We simply cannot exist there. And so it was a very dangerous thing to enter God's presence. And this is where priests came in. These people that were appointed to devote their lives entirely to preparation to enter God's presence on our behalf because it was such a serious and scary thing to consider. And so in this way, priests were understood to be a set apart as well, that they were devoting their lives to be holy enough to enter God's presence. And it would have been incredibly comforting and reassuring to know that even if we felt unprepared or too afraid to go to God, we still had someone who could go to God for us. The people of the book of Hebrews that this was written to were accustomed to this way of interacting with God. They were accustomed to having priests who interacted with God on their behalf. And within this tradition, they had what was known as a high priest who was chiefly responsible for going to God on the people's behalf. And once a year, this was done in a very specific way, the Day of Atonement. And I want to show you a little bit about this. I've got a graphic to show you because in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, there was this area known as the Holy of Holies. This was the place where God was thought to dwell. This was the most holy place in the temple. And only once a year would the priest go into this to make a sacrifice as an atoning sacrifice for the people's sin. The area was called the Holy of Holies. And the high priest would spend days preparing to go into this space, to make sure that they were set apart, that they were holy, that they were purified enough to enter this space without losing their life. They had ritual washings that they did. They had rehearsing this ceremony over and over to make sure they got it just right. They avoided all kinds of impurity. They would stay up all night praying and reading scripture. And then when the day came, they would begin by making the sacrifice of a bull. And then after sacrificing the bull, they would make a sacrifice of a goat. And the priest would enter into this area, the Holy of Holies, and he would burn incense and burn coals to fill the room in order to shield him from the direct presence of God. So that even though he was in this space, this Holy of Holies, the smoke would still shield him from the direct presence of God. And they would bring then the blood from the lamb and from the sacrifice in and place it on the altar. And this was how Israel made atonement for their sin. The reason that they did this was the understanding that sin and death had been linked in the Garden of Eden. That to disobey God's instructions would ultimately lead to death of all kinds. And so sin was the condition, the illness, death was the outcome of that condition. And the sacrifice that the priest made once a year was a way of saying to God, we are sorry. And a way of pleading with God that the death of the animal would be an acceptable replacement for their own. I go into all of that because it's helpful for us to have that image and understanding of the sacrificial system, and in particular this day, as we understand what this author was trying to say to us about Jesus. The first thing to understand about this is that this system and how they understood, this was how they understood how to heal their relationship with God. That with Jesus, this system, however, was gone. The system of sacrifices had been completed and fulfilled. It was finished because of Jesus' sacrifice. It wasn't a system that was done away with or canceled. It was completed and fulfilled in Jesus. And so there can be, for these early Christians, I imagine there was a little bit of a sense of uncertainty in that. Of like, okay, we're so used to making sacrifices, but you're saying we're still good with God if we don't keep making these sacrifices. Are you sure? Like, what if we misunderstood? Should we still be making these sacrifices? Or more common to especially us religious people, do I get extra credit if I keep making these sacrifices? And the author is communicating, no. But he says, but if it is a high priest you want, we have the very best one, Jesus. What is it that makes Jesus the better high priest? This is where our scripture verse this week comes in. Beginning in verse 14, it says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. I love what the author does here, this language of a great high priest. It symbolizes that they are the supreme high priest, the highest high priest, but there's also an evaluation. This is the best high priest there could ever be. It plays that double role. But with Jesus, what he's saying is, look, our high priest hasn't just passed through the Holy of Holies. He has passed through the heavens, the place where God dwells at all times. And so he's saying, look, don't let go of your confession because we don't enter the Holy of Holies anymore, but hold on to it all the more because we have the priest who has passed through the heavens. We have even greater reason to hold on to our confession that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. But I want to add this part, which is that our high priest is not just anyone. This is the very Son of God. And so what that means is that the one who God dwells in him when he comes to us, this is the first reason Jesus is the very best high priest. Jesus brings the Holy of Holies to us. That we no longer have to go into this space, but he brings the presence of God to us. John chapter 2, verse 19, Jesus says these words, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. He's saying, look, I will be the temple. The presence and the Spirit of God will dwell in me. And so the first thing is that Jesus brings this Holy of Holies to us. Second thing, verse 15, it says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin." The subcontext here is that it seemed to be that there were some priests who were out of touch, that they spent so much of their life and their time preparing to go into the Holy of Holies that they were not actually with the people that they were preparing to represent. Maybe you've had similar conversations with friends and gotten the sense of like, I don't do church because pastors are so out of touch. They don't know what it's like to actually be in the real world. The pastors kind of get in their holy huddle, but they lose touch with reality and the struggles of real life. There's just these platitudes aren't going to just fix all of my problems. And so the second reason Jesus is the great high priest is because Jesus is a high priest who isn't out of touch. To tell you what I mean, in college, we would have a weekly chapel service. And one week we had somewhat of a controversial speaker come and preach named Tony Campolo. I don't know how many of you know of Tony Campolo, but he is what I would refer to as kind of one of the original, quote, liberal evangelicals. He brought sort of a controversial spin to things, but he was preaching this Sunday, or at this chapel service, and he was preaching on Jesus telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I want to call this story to mind real quick, just so we all have it in mind. It's the story of this man who is traveling down a dangerous road. And while he's traveling down this road, robbers come on him, they take him, they beat him, and they rob him, and they leave him for dead. And this man is just laying on the side of this road, on the edge of death, and a priest comes by. And the priest, seeing this man, kind of steps over him and keeps on going. Well, then a Levite, another major religious leader in this day, comes. He sees this man and goes around this man. And then finally, a Samaritan, the least likely that you would think that would come and help a Jewish man, comes and takes care of him. And Tony Campolo explained in this moment, look, we call it a parable, but the text doesn't say where this story came from. And he asked, where do you think Jesus got this story? And his argument was, what he proposed is that what if Jesus knew this because it was Jesus's own story? What if Jesus is the one who had been attacked and robbed and left for dead on the road? What if Jesus had been stepped over by a priest and then by a Levite before finally being cared for by the least likely to do so, a Samaritan? Now, there is nothing that tells us that this was Jesus' story or that it wasn't, but the power of my point is that it could have been. That in Jesus, God lowered himself so far as to be capable of being attacked and beaten within an inch of his life, and then stepped over by the very people who are called and chosen to care for and sympathize with our weakness in God's name. Jesus is the priest who understands our weakness. How does that change your understanding of how Jesus gets us? Understands, he can sympathize with us. I think this is powerful because the truth is we don't want only a God who is strong enough to save us. We have a God who understands what it feels like to need saving. Yeah. And then finally, verse 16, the last thing that this verse speaks to is, so it says, therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Going back to the story I started with about this teacher who I kind of had this immense respect, almost fear for. But going back to that story, something really fascinating happened during that school year. And that is that I discovered that one of my friends was this teacher's son. And I discovered that because I was going home with him one day and found out, that we were going to need to go to her classroom after school until she was ready to go home. And I have to tell you, learning that my friend was her son changed the dynamic between me and this teacher so much. Walking in there suddenly felt so much less intimidating. I felt almost like I was being welcomed in as a son myself because I was there with her son. And the power of that is that when we look at Jesus as this great high priest, Jesus doesn't just go into God's presence on our behalf, but he takes us with him. And so the third thing is that Jesus makes us sons or daughters and priests as well. That Jesus transforms our relationship to the Father. That we're invited now to interact with him as a son or a daughter. And that we can do that in tremendous freedom and boldness and confidence. We may now enter the Holy of Holies whenever we would like because we do not need another mediator other than Jesus himself. 1 Peter 2:9 refers to the early church as a royal priesthood. That all of us, because of the sacrifice that Jesus made, because he is our mediator, our great high priest, we no longer need to have someone go to God on our behalf, but we can do that directly. We have a doctrine in the Christian teaching called the priesthood of all believers. And the priesthood of all believers is the Christian doctrine that every person who belongs to Christ has direct access to God through Jesus. You have direct access to God through Jesus. How is that possible? How did Jesus change this? The author of Hebrews will go on later in the book to talk about how Jesus is this ultimate sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice, the final and complete sacrifice. And he says in chapter 10, verse 4, "For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." Exactly what they had used on this day of atonement. Verse 12, "But this man, after offering one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. For by one offering he has perfected forever those who are sanctified." He has sat down next to the throne of God and invites us to come boldly to that throne. For those of us who identified with that first thought that I shared, the idea that the only God that I would worship is the one who accepts me just as I am, well, I want you to know that is this God. That God accepts you just as you are, but it's not because of who you are. He accepts you because of what he has done on your behalf. He accepts you just as you are. For those of us who identified more with that second thought, that we feel like we just carry too much shame and brokenness and guilt, that we are unforgivable, we know that because of what he has done, that shame no longer has to paralyze us. That guilt, we no longer have to be weighed down by it. That we are no longer unworthy. We are not unforgivable. We have been forgiven and made worthy in Jesus. One of the things that we have to reckon with is this idea of blood as a part of the sacrifice. That is very foreign to us in our world today. But blood was the evidence and still is the evidence of life. And blood spilled is evidence of a life that has been taken, a life that has been given. And so what we know by Jesus laying himself down, giving up his life, spilling out his blood, he made the sacrifice that would end all sacrifices. And that we can enter the Holy of Holies. We can enter God's presence boldly and full of confidence because that blood has made us clean and made us pure. Not because of what we've done or haven't done, but because of who he is. And so my invitation for you this morning is to just imagine that you can come to the throne room of God right now, full of confidence, full of boldness. And so I want to invite you, let's just close our eyes for a moment. I want you to just take a moment and imagine that you can approach God this morning full of boldness and confidence because of what Jesus has done. And maybe this morning you just need to acknowledge, God, you are the one who accepts me just as I am. Thank you that you accept me just as I am. Or maybe you need to just say, God, I accept the truth this morning that I am no longer unforgivable. That what I've done is not unforgivable. I want to acknowledge the truth that because of what you have done, I can be free of my shame. Because of what you have done, I am worthy to stand in God's presence. Would you just take a moment and connect with him in these moments?